Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight for a program we will be calling Washington Report. And thank you very much. I'm Rod Grams. This is the first edition in what will be a monthly program here on your local cable stations. Now, during each half hour, we'll be looking beyond the headlines that you might be reading in your local paper, dig a little deeper than the lead stories you see on the evening news, and try to give you a new and more in-depth perspective on just what's happening in Washington. And along the way, we'll be talking about current events, the important legislation making its way through Congress, and what it means to all Minnesotans. And because democracy in action means giving the people a loud and strong voice in their government, we'll give you a chance to be heard as well. At the end of the program, I'll tell you how to reach my offices both in Minnesota and in Washington, and I'll hope you'll write or call. And if I'm going to represent you effectively in the Senate, I need to know how you feel about the issues that we'll be discussing. I'm looking forward to these programs. Well, as you know, there was a tremendous wind that swept through Washington on Election Day last November, and nobody realizes that more than my special guest. A year ago, he was Senate Minority Leader, but with the Republicans now firmly in control of both chambers of Congress, he joins us today as Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole. And Senator Dole, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to our program, and thank you very much for helping us inaugurate this. And I said during the campaign, and of course during your many visits to help me in my election, that the first important vote that I was going to take, and that was going to be to make Bob Dole the Majority Leader and not the Minority Leader. And I think really when I just got home now from a series of town meetings over the Easter recess, we're talking about the mood of Americans. How do you assess right now the first 100 days and how America is reacting to the Republican control of Congress?
I think fairly well. I mean, a lot of people may not understand everything that's happened. The House has moved very quickly. That's one thing the Founding Fathers wanted to make certain that the Senate would be a little more deliberate. We're very deliberate, as you found out, being new in the Senate. Sometimes we're too deliberate. But I think there's general support, not partisan, but pretty much broad public support for trying to downsize the government, rein in the government, reconnect the government with American values, all those things that we think we're doing. And I might say at times with a lot of help from the other side. Some have been bipartisan, some have been less so. I think the one big disappointment, as we both know, was the failure by one vote of getting a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. We had 98% of the Republicans, 29% of the Democrats. I still believe there's somebody out there who may change their position in the right direction this year, and we could still pass the balanced budget amendment, send it back to Minnesota and the other states for ratification, let them make the final judgment.
Around Minnesota, I held 5 town meetings in all corners of the state, and the reaction was much the same, as you said, more bipartisan. And I mean, there were Democrats and Republicans and independents in the audiences, and I don't think any were backing away from the commitment that we need to balance the budget and that things have to change in Washington. So if we're talking really about bipartisan support, really the country moving us in more of a conservative direction, why do you think it's being led that way?
I think the people are pushing it. My view is the American people expect us to get certain things done. They know that politics is very competitive. Most people do. Most people know that they may feel strongly about their party, but even more importantly, they feel strongly about certain things getting done. And I would say reducing the federal budget is right up at the top. That's why the balanced budget is so important. I think it's also interesting, the first bill passed in the Senate, in fact, the first bill signed by President Clinton, was applying all the laws to Congress. We applied to everybody else in America, every small businessman, businesswoman in Minnesota, Kansas, wherever. That was largely the work of Senator Grassley from Iowa, but you played a role in it, others played a role in it. That was a good first step. Then we followed that up with unfunded mandates, which says, in effect, if you don't send the money to the state of Minnesota or the county or wherever it may be, you don't send the mandate, because a mandate, in effect, is a tax. Somebody has to pay for it. And so we've had some success on the Senate side, not as much as the House has had, but we'll catch up.
Now, over the last 30 years especially, the power has really moved from state and local governments to Washington. The 10th Amendment has been repeated over and over, and I know in our town meetings, people have started out the meeting almost unanimously,
right.
And every place I've went is get government off my back, get Washington out of my pockets. How is really the stronger federal government, not that we don't need a strong and effective federal government, but really why is this feeling, do you think, pervading back home that Washington has gotten too big and too intrusive in the lives of average Americans?
I think, first of all, there's a recognition that government does a lot of good things. No question about it. We can name a dozen 2 dozen, maybe hundreds. But I think at the same time, the government's gotten too big. It's too unresponsive, it's too intrusive, as you say, it's too undemocratic. So I think people have sort of dusted off the 10th Amendment. It's only 28 words in length. It doesn't take long to read it. It says, in effect, unless the power is reserved to the federal government, it ought to flow back to the states or to the people. We have good governors in every state, Democrats or Republicans, and it doesn't make any difference. In some cases, they're going to do the right thing in their states, or they're going to be ousted. State legislators, regardless of party, they're closer to the people. The governors are closer to the people. 200 years ago, when we had the Bill of Rights and this was the 10th Amendment, we were trying to get away from a centralized government. But as you said, the last 30, 40 years, it's all moved towards Washington, power taken away from the states, local communities, and the people themselves. So my view is the American people are about 6 months or a year ahead of us, and they're insisting, demanding, I guess would be the right word, that we make some changes, that we downsize government, make it more user-friendly, make it less intrusive. It's not that they don't have some respect for government. Some people don't have any respect for it. Most people do. And I think we're on the right track. It's going to take some time. It may take all this year, it may take all next year, it may even take into 1997, 1998.
How would you assess the first 100 days? I know you mentioned that the Senate has done a couple of bills, but when compared to the House, a lot of people feel that we're lagging behind a little bit. In the second 100 days, I know you have said, and the 100 nights have got to belong to the Senate because we have a lot of work.
I think the days and the nights. I think one thing you're going to see are fewer recesses on the Senate side, longer days, more votes on Mondays and Fridays, maybe even on a Saturday or two, because we've got to catch up. And I think while we have a lot of bipartisanship, I think there is a little effort by some in the Senate to slow down everything we do so we won't get it done. And we're spending far too much time. We've also done paperwork simplification, some regulatory reform, line item veto. So we're sort of keeping up, and we'll catch up with welfare reform. We're going to change the crime bill, take a look at health care again, not the massive government-run system, but health care, telecommunications legislation. We've got a big docket on the Senate side. I think the next 100 days are going to belong to us. 100 days, as you said, 100 nights.
What about balanced budget amendment? I know you said we'll probably get another vote on that.
I hope there's going to be a Democrat out there who, for the right reason, decides, wait a minute, let's go back and take a look at this, and changes his or her vote. Just takes one vote. Then I can bring it up, no debate, have 2 quick votes, and we'd send this back to the states for ratification. My state, your states, the other 48 states, and let the people decide. I think that's where the decision ought to come. Let the people decide. Why are you afraid of letting the people decide?
We'll be back in just a moment. We'll have more on our Washington report with Majority Leader Bob Dole right after this.
Why don't you come up here, Pumpkin?
What are you doing, Larry?
Well, Vince, I've asked my pumpkin to sit on my lap to prove a point.
And what is that, your Larryness?
Even if we fasten our safety belts, even if you hold on tight, even if you were watching the road,
Yeah?
in a crash, your pumpkin will be nothing but a squash.
You could learn a lot from a dummy. Use child safety seats.
We love that little pumpkin to pieces.
More than half of America's most important military decisions are made here. No, it's not the Pentagon or NORAD or the headquarters of Air Combat Command. It's the place that employs over 50% of our armed forces. It's where you work.
See you in a couple weeks.
So when your employees in the National Guard and Reserve need time off to serve, give them the freedom to protect ours.
And again, we're talking with Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole on our Washington report this week. And again, Senator, thank you very much for taking your time to be with us. I'm very pleased to have you with. What are we going to see, or is there going to be a more active Senate? Now, you've mentioned all the things we just were talking about. What are some of the important things that you would put at the top of the agenda or on the docket that the Senate really has to address? I know we talked, there's many things, the balanced budget amendment, the budget that is coming out of
tax cuts.
Tax cuts.
We're going to have tax cuts over. We're going to reduce the capital gains rate. We're going to do some of the things you've worked on for a long time against the child care credits. We may not go quite as far as the House, but again, I think there was a promise to the American people And let me say right quick before somebody said, oh, there go the Republicans, they're going to cut taxes to take care of Medicare. That's just not the case. If we didn't cut taxes one dime or didn't do anything in the budget, we'd still have to address Medicare because the trustees appointed by President Clinton tell us we ought to act now because it's going to be out of money in 6 to 7 years. When it's out of money, you can't pay anybody's doctor bills. So we'd like to address it very quickly, just as we did back in 1983 when Social Security was in difficulty. We had a bipartisan commission. President Reagan got together with Speaker O'Neill at that time and with Senator Baker, who was Majority Leader, Republican, and Democrat Speaker, Republican President. I was on the commission. Senator Moynihan was on the commission. And we worked it out. We made Social Security going to be whole now, I think, until the year about 2017. But Medicare is in trouble. We need to address it. So let's tax cuts, Medicare. We're going to preserve, protect, and improve Medicare. We're not talking about draconian changes in Medicare. Don't want to scare any senior citizens. But if we can just restrain the growth instead of 10% a year to 7% of the year, we can make some of these changes. Superfund, a lot of sites haven't been cleaned up. As I said, telecommunications, this is the information age. We are on the cutting edge in America and all this technology. It's a big, big, important bill. Creates jobs in Minnesota, Kansas, everywhere. So these are outside the so-called contract, but they're very important. Coming back to welfare reform, can't be a bigger issue than welfare reform. You got the budget. The budget's coming out. That's going to be tough. We're going to try to get a balanced budget even without the constitutional amendment. Got the Farm Bill, 1995 Farm Bill. It'll be very important in farm states. We're going to take a look at spending, not only in commodity programs, but in the food stamp program, school lunch program, maybe even the WIC program. Everything from A to Z is on the table with the exception of Social Security.
Now, I think what people really should realize more is that the Republicans aren't out to gut these programs,
That's right.
but maybe just to change how they're administered or
Right.
approach into solving the problems, and that we're not going to turn our backs on those who really need help. And I think the rhetoric that we hear in Washington would lead some people to believe, especially the vulnerable and those who
That's
really
right.
need help,
The very
maybe some
young
of
and
the
the very
seniors, that all of a sudden their benefits are going to change. And I think that's, you know, we're all like political bullets that we can fire.
Right.
But at times, especially when it comes to Medicare, we should put aside this and really, like they did with Social Security in '82 and '83, work to find a bipartisan solution because it's too important of an issue to leave to political rhetoric.
I know that some senior citizens, when they watch some of these news reports, must think it's terrible back here. I mean, if that's all say all the income they have is a Social Security check, and then they have Medicare or Medicaid. Let's just take Medicaid. We can save money in Medicaid by sending it back to the states, block granting it, let Governor Carlson in Minnesota and the state legislature make decisions. They're a lot closer to the people. Welfare reform, let's send money back to the states. They're just as sensitive about the needs of the people. They're closer to the people. And we believe if we take welfare, we can do the same thing or better, have better programs for people for about 20% less. So it's not that we're trying to gut the programs. We're trying to change the direction. We've talked about power to the states, power to the people. You can't have it unless you do it.
One thing, too, I think people should be really aware of is that if we don't make these changes, that if we're going to meet the needs, the costs are going up. So where would we, or where would the Democrats or the liberals propose to raise taxes? So in other words, if we don't make some maybe fundamental changes in trying to curtail the growth of these programs, people can't expect them to grow without additional revenues.
Right.
And that means, like in Social Security, when Social Security, the FICA tax was raised and things like that. So would they have to be honest and say that if we don't really restructure this, that people could expect higher taxes? So they really got a choice out. Do they want to pay more, or do they want to look at a different way of administering the program?
And most of these, as you know, are going to be young couples who may want to help their grandparents with Medicare and Social Security. But most of them pay more now in Medicare, Social Security tax, and they pay an income tax. So it's getting to be a pretty heavy burden. And it's one thing to say, oh, just raise the taxes. Well, I think under these trustees' report on Medicare, for example, again, which came out about a month ago, which says fix it quickly. They're Clinton appointees. President Clinton appointed these people. One thing they in effect recommend by implication is doubling the tax rates. Well, we've had enough tax increases. I think the American people expect us to do better. And we ought to do it in a bipartisan way. Medicare affects everybody, whether Republicans, Democrats, Independents. Welfare affects a lot of people who've never had a fair shot in life. We know the government has to help sometimes, but we want to do it more efficiently. We're just as caring as anybody else, and we want to do it for less cost.
So just raising the taxes might be a short-term fix, but it wouldn't cure the problem. So in other words, at one point, those new additional tax dollars would again not serve the purpose, and we'd be facing either with another huge deficits or then addressing the problem. So you can't put off till tomorrow what you should
That's right.
do today.
And there are a lot of abuses in these federal. When you get a program that big to serve millions of beneficiaries, going to be abuses. Abuses by some of the recipients, abuses by the providers, whether they're doctors, hospitals, taxi drivers who, this one little example with the millions and $1 million of waste people take back and forth their doctor. Some of the taxi companies that run up big bills, just hundreds of examples where it's waste and fraud and abuse, and that we ought to do away with before we even take a look at anything else. But I just hope people who are watching that understand that if we don't do these things, as you indicated, Rod, what about somebody's children? What about senior citizen 4 or 5 years from now? If you don't have any money in Medicare, you can't pay the bill. You better hope we fix it, and fix it very quickly.
So in order to guarantee a better future, or at least the program that'll be there 20 years from now, I always say maybe we're more afraid of the surgery than if we don't. I mean,
right.
The surgery might be a little painful, but if we don't have the surgery, it could result in some real serious problems down the road.
That's right. If you're going to keep this mandate approach, raise tax a little bit, do this a little bit. And a lot of these, my colleagues, get on the floor and they wring their hands and all this about children. Now, nobody's going to go without medical care in America. No child, not without food. This is America. But what about the children 10, 20 years from now? If we don't tighten up the budget, balance the budget, and get back some sanity in what we spend around here, what about today's children's children? Are they going to have an opportunity? I think it's going to be marginal at best, unless we do what we should do. And again, it ought to be done regardless of our party.
We'll be back and talk more with Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole on our Washington Report in just a moment.
Everyone has their own idea of a hero.
Magic Johnson.
Arnold Schwarzenegger. Mr. Neal.
My hero, Gloria Stefan.
Martin Luther King. Mr. Hope.
These are teachers, but to the kids they've reached, they're heroes. They've given them hope. They've given them choices. They've changed their lives.
Well, the children are the heroes.
The most fulfilling thing is watching a child succeed.
I just like to help them make their dreams come true.
Teachers have the power to wake up young minds, to be heroes, to make a difference. Reach for that power. Teach. If you want to make an impact on our future, call 1-800-45-TEACH.
Mr. Wilkins.
Mrs. Eisenhardt.
Mr. Adler.
Be a teacher. Be a hero.
There may be something you're not seeing here, because the first sign of breast cancer isn't easy for you to spot. That's why a yearly mammogram is a must, especially if you're over 50. Doctors say the older you get, the higher the risk of breast cancer. But early detection increases your chance of successful treatment. While you may not be able to see something this small, a mammogram can. Call the American Cancer Society. Early detection is the best protection.
And again, on this edition of our Washington Report, we are pleased to have joining us the Senate Majority Leader, Bob Dole of Kansas. Bob, thank you very much again for being with us. Tax cuts, balancing the budget. I hear this all the time from people back in Minnesota. They've heard so much it's either or, either balance the budget or get tax cuts. We can't have both. Do you believe we can offer the tax cuts that Republicans talked about and still balance the budget? I think we can.
We are going to do it. We can do it. Obviously, we need to cut spending first. I think that's what most people do. Before you have any tax cuts, be sure you cut spending. But let me get back to the Medicare. It doesn't mean cutting Medicare, because whatever we do, we're going to have to fix Medicare. And we're talking about other spending restraints. And it's the old story, class warfare. Our liberal friends keep saying we're going to take money away from people in Medicare and children and give tax cuts to the rich. Now, I hope people don't subscribe to that. In your program you've been working on for years before you came to the Senate, you're talking about families, keeping families together, children, middle-class Americans. this is what it's all about. We don't need to help the, quote, rich, and we'll take care of the very low income. It's that middle America that we're concerned about, and that's what this tax reduction is all about. We're trying to make it easier for middle-class Americans to keep their family together, to do things they want to do.
Now, I know you're involved in a very important campaign yourself, the presidential elections of 1996. One thing I was struck about during my town meetings is in 1992, Jerry Brown brought up an idea of a flat tax. It was almost laughed off the stage. But in every town meeting I had, people brought it up, and basically we're talking about fairness in taxation. Do you think that there's going to be a mandate out of the 96 elections about overhauling the tax system in the United States?
It may come even before that. As you may recall, Newt Gingrich and I asked Jack Kemp, who certainly, this is his strong suit on economic growth and tax reform, to head up an 11-member commission. He'll be the chairman, be 10 other members, to take a look at the whole tax system, replacement for the present system, make it flatter, fairer, simpler, whatever, and then give recommendations back to both me and Speaker Gingrich sometime in October, November. And if we can get it together quickly enough, it might become an issue in the 1966 election, congressional elections. And again, I think it's going to have a lot of bipartisan support. This is something that most Americans are so frustrated. You know, we just had Tax Freedom Day on May 6th. On May 6th, you started working, on May 7th, you started working for yourself. Up until May 6th, you worked every day to pay your federal, state, and local taxes. Now, as the date keeps moving forward, next year it'll be probably May 8th, 9th, or 10th. We'd like to move it in the other direction. So we're excited about it. I know Jack Kemp is, and we look forward to his report.
I know you're talking the national average. In Minnesota, they're still working to pay the taxes.
Oh, really? They haven't reached it?
They haven't reached it until about the 19th of May or something like that. So it's one of the unluckier parts of the country. Or in other issues, the Farm Bill we talked about. Minnesota's economy, 70% depends on agriculture, much as Kansas, a very big agricultural state. Farm Bill is going to be very important. What do you see is coming out in 1995? Again, I hear farmers telling me we can't bandage up old programs. We need to set in motion where farm programs are going to go for the next 10 years.
Oh, we'll have a 5-year program. Some suggest we ought to have a 10-year program. It ought to be market-oriented. We ought to be out there looking for markets. Most farmers would much prefer, you know, market activity than subsidy activity. We're going to take a look at cost of commodity programs. We have to reduce, to some extent, like everything else. Everything's on the table. We can't get there unless we take a look at agriculture, whatever, all the way from A to Z. But ag's had a pretty good hit the last couple of budget cycles. But we'll look at it again. I'm not certain just what kind of a farm program we'll end up with. It may be some modification of the 1990 Farm Bill. We're also taking a look at ethanol, which is important to Minnesota, Iowa, states like ours, because the administration put together something the court has struck down, which we predicted early on. So if they're going to make ethanol competitive in this reformulated gasoline program, the administration needs to take some corrective action.
On the crime bill, is there going to be, are we going to revisit the crime bill?
We're going to revisit the crime bill. It's going to be, I can tell you, it's going to be a tough one to change because the liberals are going to resist any change, whether it's habeas corpus, which means endless appeals. They're not going to, even though President Clinton would like to change habeas corpus, I don't think the liberals are going to let us do it. But we're going to try to recycle some of that money back to the states and back to the local communities. I just talked to a fellow from Iowa when I came down and said, don't give it all to the states, don't forget the counties, the cities, because we have trouble getting it from the states. So the answer is yes. There's about $8 billion we'd like to recycle back into states. If you want more policemen, you get more policemen. If you want a squad car, you get a squad car. Let the local people decide instead of somebody at the federal level.
Oklahoma City and the tragedy that happened there. And of course, anti-terrorism legislation is being bantered about, and I think a big concern is that we don't have a knee-jerk reaction and really take away more of our freedoms and rights. I don't think we could have enough laws on the books that could have prevented Oklahoma City from happening, that tragedy. What do you see coming out of this, and how do we balance the desire right now to offer more security, but yet not trample on the rights, you know, of individuals?
Someone told me, said, Bob, when you're drafting this legislation or you pass it, you ought to ask yourself, is this going to look this good a year from now or 2 years from now as it looks today? Because there's a lot of emotion now. It was a dastardly thing that happened in Oklahoma City. You do most anything to get at these people. But what about a year from now or 5 years? What about some innocent group or innocent person? So we have to be very, very careful when you start looking at this. You don't trample on somebody's constitutional rights. And I'm a little worried when you get the military involved. Maybe there's a way you can do it, but people are fearful when the military is involved in law enforcement. I think we go very slowly. And then when I think there are a lot of areas we agree on: tighter penalties, heavier penalties, quick deportation proceedings for criminal aliens who come to this country, give them some judicial review. This is America, but get them back to their own country as quickly as possible. We don't need those people in America. But we told the President we'd have a bill on his desk by the end of May. Now, that may slip a little bit. We're trying to work with the President. We hope we can. Again, this, if anything, ought to be bipartisan. It ought to be counterterrorism legislation.
I don't want to end on this, but I have to ask you about the Foster nomination, and then I want to ask one other question. So just briefly, is the Foster nomination still in trouble?
I think so. I think he did a pretty good job himself, but I think it's still in some difficulty. I'm going to meet with him later on after the committee vote, talk to him, and then determine what to do.
We have about 40 seconds left. I'd just like to ask you, as I mentioned, you're involved in just gearing up for a '96 presidential race. What do you see as the biggest issues and the things that you have to communicate to the Americans to be successful in '96?
I think it's what we started off, sort of reining in the federal government, reconnecting the government with American values, reasserting our rightful place in the sun. These are very broad, basic principles. And then sort of flesh out your agenda, whether it's Bob Dole or anybody else running the next several months. And obviously Minnesota is a big, big, important state. But my view is the American people are looking for leadership, hopefully somebody who's been tested, somebody with experience. But it'll all be over a year from now. The primaries will be over. Somebody will be the Republican nominee, and I assume Clinton will be the Democratic nominee.
Well, good luck to you, Bob.
Thank
you very much again for taking your time to join us on our Washington Report. As we mentioned at the beginning of the program, there will be information on your TV screens to tell you where you can write or call my offices either in Anoka or Washington. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much. I'll see you next month.